In the summer of 1884, workers finishing the Washington Monument. The project had stalled for 23 years and was in its final phase of completion under Army Corps of Engineers supervision, broke through the original 1848 foundation excavation during drainage work in the monument's base and encountered something inside the foundation fill that stopped construction for 11 days while the Corps superintendent on site sent an urgent message to Washington requesting guidance. The construction resumed. The monument was completed and capped with its aluminum apex on December 6, 1884, in a ceremony attended by government officials and covered by the national press. In January of 1885, Congress passed a resolution closing the monument to public access for purposes described in the resolution as structural assessment and remediation of foundation conditions. The monument remained closed for 13 months. It reopened in February of 1886. The structural assessment and remediation report that would normally have been filed with the Army Corps of Engineers following a project of that scope and duration does not appear in the Corps' project records for the Washington Monument. It is not in the National Archives under any filing designation I have been able to locate. The 13 months exist. The report does not. I came to this through the resolution itself, which is in the Congressional Record for January of 1885, and which is one of the shorter resolutions Congress passed in that session. 4 sentences, authorizing the closure, citing structural assessment, appropriating a modest sum for the work, and requiring a report to the Senate Committee on Public Buildings and Grounds upon completion. The report to the Senate Committee is what I went looking for first, because a required report is a document that should exist and whose absence is a documented fact rather than an inference. The Senate Committee records for the relevant period are in the National Archives. I read through the committee's incoming correspondence for 1885 and 1886. The report is not there. There is an acknowledgement in the committee's outgoing correspondence of a communication from the Army Corps regarding the monument's foundation work, dated March of 1886, which says only that the committee has received the Corps' communication and that the matter is considered resolved. The communication from the Corps that the committee received is not in the file. What the committee received and what it considered resolved is not described in any document I found in the committee's records. By the time you reach the end of what I am going to tell you, you will understand that the 13-month closure of the Washington Monument in 1885 and 1886 was not primarily a structural remediation project, and that the foundation condition it addressed was not a condition the Army Corps created a public record of addressing, and that the something inside the foundation fill that stopped construction for 11 days in the summer of 1884 is described, partially, incompletely, in a document that was not created for preservation, in the personal papers of the Corps superintendent who sent the urgent message to Washington. His papers are not in a federal archive. They are in a house in Virginia. And the man who owns the house knew what he had and had been waiting for 20 years for someone to ask the right questions. There is one more document in the public record that belongs here before we reach the foundation history, because it establishes something about the site that the standard account of the monument's construction does not address. The Masonic cornerstone ceremony for the Washington Monument was held on July 4, 1848, attended by President Polk, members of Congress, and the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. The ceremony followed the Masonic cornerstone tradition precisely, including the placement of a sealed copper box inside the cornerstone containing documents and coins of the era. This is well documented. What is less documented, present in the ceremony records but not in the standard histories, is a notation in the Grand Lodge's own account of the ceremony describing the site preparation that preceded the laying of the cornerstone. The Grand Lodge account, which I found in the Scottish Rite Supreme Council archive in Washington, notes that the site had been prepared by the construction crew, and that the crew, in the course of that preparation, had encountered what the account describes as ancient stonework at a depth below the projected foundation floor, which had been removed and set aside at the direction of the superintendent of construction. Removed and set aside. In 1848, before the foundation was poured. Which means that whatever Aldermott found in 1884 inside the foundation fill, below the level of the 1848 construction, in ground he was certain had not been disturbed since before the city was built, may not have been the first encounter. It may have been the second. Consider what the Washington Monument's foundation history actually was before the 1884-1886 period, because the structural context is the only thing that makes the Corps superintendent's reaction to what he found legible. The monument's foundation was laid in 1848 on a site that the original design committee had selected partly for symbolic reasons. The intended position at the precise intersection of the north-south and east-west lines of the L'Enfant plan for the city, and partly because the original survey suggested the ground there was adequate for a structure of that weight. The original survey was optimistic. When construction began in 1848, workers discovered that the topsoil at the site extended to a much greater depth than the survey had indicated before reaching the firm ground required for a foundation of that mass. The foundation was enlarged and deepened. Construction proceeded on the enlarged foundation until 1854, when the Know Nothing Party gained control of the Washington Monument Society, and the project stalled over a dispute about a donated stone from Pope Pius IX. Funding collapsed. The half-finished monument sat, exposed at its truncated top, for 23 years. When the Army Corps took over the project in 1877 and resumed construction, their first task was to assess the condition of the original foundation after 23 years of exposure, variable moisture, and the slow settling that affects masonry foundations in soft ground. What they found in the Corps' own 1877 assessment report was that the foundation had settled unevenly. The east side had sunk slightly relative to the west, and that the fill material inside the foundation's outer shell, the rubble and concrete mix that had been packed around the original 1848 stonework to stabilize it during the construction pause, had shifted in ways that created voids. The Corps reinforced the foundation, grouted the voids, and proceeded with construction. The 1877 assessment and remediation is fully documented. It is in the Corps archives. It describes what was found and what was done in the same dry, professional language that Army Corps engineering reports use for everything. The 1884-1886 closure produces no equivalent document. And the two situations are not equivalent, which is itself the most important fact in this account. The Corps superintendent during the final phase of construction was a man named Silas Crispin Aldermott, a career military engineer who had supervised several major infrastructure projects before taking the monument assignment in 1882. His appointment to the project is in the Corps records. His construction progress reports, filed monthly during the 1882-1884 completion phase, are in the Corps records. They are routine, thorough, and exact, the reporting of a methodical man who understood that large public projects required careful documentation. And then, in the summer of 1884, the monthly reports stop. There is a gap in the filing record of nearly 4 months, followed by a single brief report dated October of 1884, noting that the monument's construction was proceeding normally, and that the aluminum cap installation was scheduled for December. The gap that should contain the July and August reports, the period when construction stopped for 11 days and the urgent message went to Washington, contains nothing. Not a report. Not an explanatory note. Not an acknowledgement of the gap. The monthly filing series simply resumes in October, as if July and August had not occurred. This is the part I keep returning to. Because Aldermott was not a man who missed filing deadlines. His monthly reports from 1882 through June of 1884 are present without exception, submitted within days of the end of each month. The gap is not an administrative oversight. The gap is a decision, and the decision was made by someone who understood that the standard reporting channel was not the appropriate channel for whatever had been found. Aldermott retired from the Corps in 1889. He settled in Culpeper, Virginia, where he died in 1903. His professional papers, notebooks, correspondence, field diaries from his various engineering assignments passed to his son, then to his grandson, and are currently held by his great-grandson, a man named Thomas Aldermott, who lives in the family house in Culpeper, and who contacted me in 2017 after reading something I had published on Army Corps documentation practices in the late 19th century. He had read his great-grandfather's papers in 2011 when he took possession of the house. He had not known what to do with what they contained. He had been waiting for someone who would know. Thomas Aldermott is not a historian. He is a retired high school teacher who inherited a house and the contents of its attic. He spent 3 months in 2011 reading through his great-grandfather's professional papers, most of which are what you would expect: administrative correspondence, engineering specifications, the unremarkable bureaucratic record of a long career. The field diary from the summer of 1884 is 38 pages long and distinguishable from the other notebooks by the change in handwriting I described, and by a piece of brown twill tape, folded 3 times, that was tied around the diary's exterior. The tape is intact. Aldermott apparently tied it himself before placing the diary in the box, and it had not been disturbed in the intervening century. Thomas Aldermott left the tape in place when he read the diary, cutting it rather than untying it, and he can tell you exactly when and why he decided not to contact anyone immediately. He needed to find someone who would understand what the diary described without requiring him to explain why it was significant, because he was not sure he could explain that without sounding like something other than what he is, which is a retired school teacher who found something he didn't expect in his great-grandfather's papers and handled it carefully. The relevant document is not a formal report. It is a field diary, the kind of pocket notebook that Army Corps engineers in the 1880s carried as a matter of practice, recording daily observations in handwriting that gets smaller and more compressed when the writer is tired or working quickly. Aldermott's field diary from the summer of 1884 covers July 14th through August 3rd, the period of the 11-day stoppage, and its immediate aftermath. And it is written in a hand that is markedly different from the careful entries in the earlier months of the same diary. It is smaller, more compressed, written faster. The entries for July 14th and 15th describe the discovery in language that I will quote from as precisely as Thomas Aldermott's transcription allows, because the original is fragile, and he made the transcription himself at my request. July 14th entry. Stopped work on drainage excavation at 0 feet 4 below existing foundation shelf. Encountered material in fill cavity inconsistent with 1848 fill records, stone not construction rubble. Dressed faces on at least 6 pieces visible, too large for removal without equipment not on site. Sent courier to Humphrey's office, awaiting instruction, have posted men at entry to keep others out. Dressed faces. On stone found inside the foundation fill of the Washington Monument, below the level of the 1848 construction, in a cavity that the 1877 Corps remediation had not reached and had not documented. July 15th entry. Humphrey's man arrived, examined cavity, ordered cavity sealed pending review. No written record of cavity contents to be made in standard reports. verbal instruction only. I am making this note for my own record only, and will not include this in project documentation. Humphreys. The reference is to Andrew A. Humphreys, a former chief of engineers who had been Aldermott's superior earlier in his career, and who was, by 1884, serving in an advisory capacity to the Corps following his retirement. The arrival of a Humphreys representative, not a standard Corps inspector, but a man sent specifically from the office of a former chief, within one day of Aldermott's message, tells you the weight the message carried when it arrived in Washington. And the verbal instruction to make no written record of the cavity contents in standard reports is the decision that explains the gap in the monthly filing series and the absence of the 1884-1886 closure documentation from the Corps archive. No written record in standard reports. Aldermott made this note for his own record only, and his own record sat in a farmhouse in Culpeper for 130 years. And that is not the final entry that matters. The field diary continues through July and August of 1884, covering the period after the cavity was sealed, describing the resumption of construction in technical terms that are ordinary. The drainage work redirected, the concrete pour resumed, the preparations for the aluminum cap proceeding. And on August 3rd, the last entry in the summer's diary, Aldermott writes a paragraph that is unlike everything before it in the notebook. It is not a construction note. It is not a technical observation. It reads as follows, again in Thomas Aldermott's transcription: I have measured the pieces as best I could from the cavity opening before sealing. The largest is not less than 8 feet in any dimension. The dressing is consistent on all faces I was able to observe. I cannot account for the presence of these stones in this location by any process I understand. The ground they were in has not been disturbed since before this city was built. I am sealing this diary and will not speak of this assignment again. I cannot account for the presence of these stones in this location by any process I understand. From a career Army Corps engineer, on a project he supervised with methodical precision for 2 years, the ground they were in has not been disturbed since before this city was built. What was under the Washington Monument when Pierre Charles L'Enfant selected that site in the 1790s, and under the construction crews in 1848, and under the Army Corps remediation team in 1877 who did not go deep enough to find it, was already there when the city was designed around it. Not brought there, not deposited during any phase of construction that any record accounts for. Present in ground that Aldermott, who had studied what the 1848 foundation crews had found and what the 1877 remediation crews had found, was certain had not been disturbed by any of the work that preceded his. The 13-month closure that followed the December 1884 dedication allowed access to the sealed cavity under conditions that are not in any document I have found, but that can be inferred from the structural configuration of the foundation and from the appropriation amount in the 1885 congressional resolution, which was sufficient for considerable work below ground. The closure ended. The committee received a communication from the Corps and considered the matter resolved. The monument has been open to the public since February of 1886, and the Washington Monument Society, which administered the structure before the Corps and which maintained its own archive of correspondence and documentation, has a gap in its own records that corresponds almost exactly to the closure period. Not a complete gap. Society records exist for 1885 and 1886. But the correspondence related to the foundation work during those 13 months is not present in the files that the Society's archive contains. This is not the only occasion on which the ground beneath Washington's monumental core has produced something that was handled outside the standard documentation channels. The construction of the mall's infrastructure in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the excavation work associated with the construction of the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials, The underground utility work done throughout the Central Mall area in the 1930s and 1940s, each of these projects generated excavation records that are in various stages of completeness in the National Archives, and each of them has at least one period of several weeks or months in which the daily or weekly excavation logs that the project should have generated are not present in the archive. Not all of these gaps are suspicious. Construction projects lose records. Archives lose series. But the gaps in the Washington Monument construction record are not the gaps of a project that lost its paperwork. They are the gaps of a project whose paperwork was deliberately routed away from the standard channel by a specific instruction from a senior official, documented in a private diary by the man who received the instruction and honored it. What was inside the Washington Monument's foundation in 1884 is 8-foot dressed stone in ground that had not been disturbed since before the city was designed. What was done about it during 13 months of closure is not in any document I have found, but is in the category of things that institutions do when they have found something they cannot explain and cannot make public and cannot ignore. They seal it, document it in a channel accessible only to the people they trust, and reopen the public face of the project as if the closure had been what the resolution said it was. Aldermott sealed his diary. His great-grandson unsealed it in 2011 and waited 6 years for someone to ask. The diary is in Culpeper. The cavity is in the foundation. The monument is open. If you know someone who has stood at the base of the Washington Monument and looked at the ground around it and thought about what is underneath, what the city was built on, what was there before the city decided what it was, share this with them. Silas Aldermott measured 8-foot stones with dressed faces in 1884 and wrote that he could not account for them, and sealed his diary and said he would not speak of the assignment again. He didn't, but he wrote it down, and it is still there in Culpeper, Virginia, and it is still there in the ground beneath the mall, and nobody who has been asked to speak of it officially has spoken of it since.